So first, I want to go back, if we could, Professor Khan. I want to go back to December 28th, when shopkeepers in Tehran's Grand Bazaar shut their doors over the collapsing currency. Within 2 weeks, protests had spread to more than 400 cities. The regime had shut off the internet entirely, and security forces were firing live ammunition at protesters. Could you talk about the significance of that moment back in December?
Well, it was that moment that has, as you rightly said, led to the current conflict within Iran. The Bazari merchants that you mentioned are and have been historically one of the most influential segments of Iranian society. They tend to align a little bit more on the conservative side of things, not necessarily theologically, but when it comes to fiscal conservatism and all, because these are small business owners. And we find that if you take a look at particularly the last, say, 130 years of Iranian history, they have been on the vanguard of a lot of political change. Iran is a republic. It has a constitution. Prior to the revolution in 1979, it was a constitutional monarchy. And a constitution that came into being in the early part of the 20th century, around 1906, led primarily by the Bazari merchants looking for circuit breakers and curbs on the Shah's, at the time, absolute power. And it shows you then how economics has always played a very big role in effectuating political change in Iran. Now, as of December of 2025, the Bazari merchants have faced a tremendous level of financial despair. And we now come to realize that it's from two main causes. One is the fact that Iran has been under international economic sanctions and embargoes going all the way back to the 1979 revolution. And as revelations now have also shown, American Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent admitted and acknowledged that the economic strain over the last 2 months was actually very intentional and was something that was promulgated by the United States. Secretary Bessent said that the U.S. has caused a dollar shortage in Iran. And of course, the U.S. dollar is the international currency of trade and for foreign exchange. And the U.S. decided to purposely deplete access to the U.S. dollar within Iran and caused an incredible collapse of the Iranian rial, the local currency. Currently, it is somewhere about 1.7 million rials to the U.S. dollar. Back in the summer of 2025, it was at about 900,000 rials. And a year ago, in January of 2025, it was 700,000 rials to the dollar. Just to give you a little bit more context, back in January of 2016, which was soon after the signing of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also known as the Iran nuclear deal, the Iranian currency was at 30,000 rials to the U.S. dollar. So here we go to an incredible amount of strain on the Iranian economy, shortages of basic goods, and access to markets. The Bazari merchants now had had enough, and they took to the streets, protesting, which is actually a fairly long and sustained tradition in Iranian society. What changed, though, in the current confirmation is who else joined the Bazaris. And some of those individuals, some of those groups were not with the permission or the endorsement or the blessing of the Bazari merchants.
I want to think a little bit more about who the protesters are. This is not a unified movement against the regime. You have Reza Pahlavi, the son of the Shah, who was overthrown in 1979, lives in the U.S. in exile. His call for protests on January 8th got 90 million views. You have some protesters chanting monarchist slogans and waving the old imperial flag. But then you have political prisoners. 5 women inside Evin prison who publicly rejected both the theocracy and the monarchy. And then you have ethnic minorities with many of their own grievances. How deep, I'm wondering, is this fracture? And is this the regime's best weapon for survival?
Well, you have an organic movement of protest, which was the Bazaris. This was an economic issue. They had really had enough. And then I guess we have to take a look at who are the opportunistic that are joining this movement. Throughout fairly recent Iranian history, say for the last 130, 150 years, if we focus on that, the protest movements have always been a matter of a rather motley assortment of people coming together. Back when there was, at the turn of the 20th century, the constitutional movement, you had left-leaning intellectuals, you had the Bazari merchants, you had some members of the clergy who were supporting a constitutional kind of check and balance on the Shah's autocracy. Similarly, when it came to the Iranian Revolution of 1979, there were clerics, there were left-leaning intellectuals, secular intellectuals, and then you had the Bazari merchants. So this has always been part of how coalitions, if you will, are built when it comes to Iran. Now, remember, they all come together and they coalesce because they have a single goal, which is to change the regime. But they don't have anything else in common on the day after the regime is changed. And so that's where you find the kind of turmoil going on. Here, I think it's self-evident that all of these different groups that have come together over the last 2 to 3 months aren't really coordinated. The Bazari merchants aren't working with the monarchists. The monarchists aren't working with people who are still non-secular in their approach and are simply looking for some level of reform, even tweaking of the regime. They're not looking for a French-style revolution, which just dismantles the entire structure. They're looking for perhaps something closer to the Japanese Meiji Restoration in 1868. They're looking...
Give us a summary of that in just a couple sentences.
Just a couple of seconds. Basically, what the Meiji Restoration was putting a constitution and a structure on top of an emperor. And it meant that we don't have to get rid of the emperor as a whole. There's 2 institutions in Iran historically that have been there for a very long time. It's hard for Americans to really appreciate the arc of time. This year marks what's going to be the 250th anniversary of the United States. Iranian civilization marks itself as 2,500 years old. It's a 10 times magnitude. I mean, that provides a whole different perspective. The monarchy is one of the oldest institutions, going all the way back to Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes. And then you have Shi'i Islam, which from 1501 with the Safavid dynasty has been its own form of very highly structuralized institution. So the idea of all of a sudden the monarchy going away in 1979 was something that Iran had to contend with because they'd had enough. Here, when it comes to going ahead and dismantling a regime that's been there for 47 years, they realize that there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of trauma that occurs. But they also realize, practically speaking, that maybe you don't have to throw the baby out with the proverbial bathwater.
As an aside, Professor, when you talk about the difference between what a young country the U.S. is versus a country like Iran, I wonder how you think that informs the way that Americans see themselves and their role in the world and their role when it comes to interacting with Iran.
Well, one of the big criticisms that occurs from not just a country like Iran, but I would even suggest a lot of our European counterparts, is Americans come in with a certain level of moxie and at the same time a certain level of naivete. And part of that is because we just haven't really been around that long. Back at the time of the conclusion of World War I, for example, President Woodrow Wilson shows up in Paris for the Paris Peace Conference at Versailles. And he was actually scorned. I mean, he was at best tolerated, but he was scorned by the leaders of France and Britain because we were seen as these young upstarts who thought we knew everything, and worse, that we were going to go ahead and explain everything to people who essentially wrote the rules of diplomacy, wrote the rules of statecraft. And you find that in some ways Iran looks at us with a similar jaundiced lens, that they have been around for a very long time, they're still around, And these kinds of changes of the political dimensions of a country are just one layer. I have heard Iranian presidents, for example, as religiously opinionated and oriented as one might think they are, citing the Achaemenid dynasty, which wasn't even Islamic, they were Zoroastrian, and speaking about them with not only pride, but demonstrating and affirming a continuity of a civilizational arc that goes back 2.5 millennia. For America, we haven't been around long enough to have a defined civilization. At best, we have a spin-off civilization from Europe, but given the diversity of America, we are the beneficiaries and the children of so many different civilizations. Iran doesn't have that, and so its perspective is completely different.
And now we're seeing these two perspectives on the world stage. This week we have American and Iranian negotiators in Geneva. Oman is mediating. Iran has said it has agreed on the main principles of a deal. And it says it could give up some enriched uranium if sanctions are lifted, but its missile program is non-negotiable. The U.S. wants zero enrichment. Now, first, I want to name this tension that perhaps our listeners can feel. The United States is negotiating with a government that just weeks ago killed thousands of its own people. President Trump threatened military intervention to protect the protesters, then pulled back. Arrests of nurses, teachers, and students are continuing as we speak. Tens of thousands are reportedly being held in secret detention sites. Is the U.S. effectively saying, we'll deal with your nuclear program, and the massacre is a separate issue? I mean, we know the Trump administration hasn't prioritized human rights abroad or here in the U.S.
And this is really the crux of the confusion, isn't it? That the administration has cited several different impetuses for intervention, and intervention at a military scale. I think it's important to remember that now there is not one but two aircraft carrier groups in the Persian Gulf, one led by the USS Gerald R. Ford and the other with the USS Abraham Lincoln. As you rightly said, initially the president said that we are going to champion those who have been adversely affected as a human rights issue and framing that. That didn't really last very long. And there has been now a kind of default to the nuclear issue. I mean, again, as you rightly said, these talks are happening in Geneva, and that Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has said that we are moving toward the next phase. But the next phase is talking about reducing the amount of enriched uranium. This was actually part of the original JCPOA.
Professor Khan, and when you say the JCPOA, to give some context here, you're talking about the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also
Correct.
known as the Iran nuclear deal.
That is correct.
Circa 2015, and it was the agreement between Iran, the U.S., the U.K., France, China, Russia, and Germany.
That's correct. The 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council and Germany. Iran had already agreed to reduce its uranium enrichment and to go ahead and send overseas any surplus that they had already had. They had agreed to compliance and to inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. And according to all reports and all evidence, they were in full compliance of these investigations prior to President Trump pulling the United States out of that agreement. So, and it's important to remember that that agreement was the result of 20 months of negotiation. The U.S. delegation included not only bureaucrats at the highest level, the U.S. Secretary of State, National Security Agency officials, but also experts on nuclear physics. We right now have the Iranian foreign minister, so the highest-ranking diplomat in Iran, Abbas Araghchi, and his counterparts are the son-in-law of the president, Jared Kushner, and the quote-unquote U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East, Stephen Witkoff, who is a real estate magnate from New York. There's an asymmetric relationship when it comes to the kind of negotiations that are occurring with two people who at best can be described as amateurs, not only in diplomacy, but also in subject matter expertise of something as complicated as a nuclear program. That probably causes some, I would imagine, to wonder how serious the United States is when it comes to these kinds of negotiations, and whether the end goal really is for the administration finding some kind of solution, some kind of détente, and some kind of de-escalation of tensions between the two countries.
From your perch, Professor, what do you think the end goal is?
It depends on the day, because as we were talking about before, on the one hand, we saw that the U.S. was holding up the banner of human rights, and now it is about trying to curtail the nuclear program, to which Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has been on record throughout his tenure as the Supreme Leader. And every Iranian president, including current President Pezeshkian, has said Iran is not interested in, and it has never been part of Iran's policy to seek the manufacture or even the acquisition of nuclear weapons. For whatever reason, the United States has decided that that is not something that can be trusted or that can be abided, again, despite the fact that during the Iran nuclear deal for 3 years, Iran was complying with whatever its responsibilities and obligations were under the treaty. There is reporting that some of the tension is actually Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who was in Washington last week, pressing the president to, number one, put on the agenda a dismantling of Iran's ballistic missile program, and also to notify the president that irrespective of any agreement, that Israel would still reserve the right to take out the ballistic missile facilities and program of Iran without needing to provide the United States with any prior notification of that. So we really don't know what this administration is seeking. The other elephant in the room is always the strategic reserves of Iran's petroleum program. And some, of course, more cynically are asking the question, is the United States looking at running the proverbial table? They've already changed the dynamics regarding Venezuela, and is Iran then the inevitable next step in order to have more control over the global supply of oil?
Professor Khan, when we think about American foreign policy, when we think about the ways that previous American leaders have focused in on Middle Eastern countries, have invaded Middle Eastern countries and exploited them and fundamentally transformed them for the worse. I'm specifically right now thinking about Iraq. I'm thinking about the fact that there were 2 U.S.-led invasions and occupations, and that the Iraqi dinar was once worth more than the American dollar before the U.S. invaded. And it invaded under the false premise of there being weapons of mass destruction. President Trump campaigned as a president that was very different from his predecessors in this way, particularly in foreign policy. But now it seems that we are seeing a lot of intervention, a lot of participation from the president in meddling in what's happening in other countries. So that is all to say, Professor Khan, is this more of the same from the American federal government?
What was it that the Who sang? Meet the old boss, same as the old boss. In some ways, President Trump is seen as, and this is ironic, a welcome change because he's saying the quiet part out loud. The international community has certainly spent an awful lot of time rolling its eyes when it's heard the rhetoric coming out of the White House, coming out of the Pentagon, coming out of the State Department, because there has been a misalignment. When we heard during the George W. Bush administration that we are moving toward bringing democracy to the region, that we would be welcomed with flowers and sweets and cakes, that didn't exactly happen with Iraq. And of course, there was also a fissure because no one was looking at regime change for democratization for the Gulf states, the Gulf monarchies. And that was, of course, known. We saw similarly this happening by administrations which tended to be seen, at least, or heard, at least, as being less hypocritical and contradictory. Under the Obama administration, when the Arab Spring started to germinate, there was clearly a cordon that the Gulf states were not going to be burdened or troubled by the idea of democratization, and the United States was certainly fine with allowing for the firewall, particularly when it came to the Gulf monarchy of Bahrain, where the clampdown of the protesters who were looking for just a little bit of political reform was absolutely brutal and categorical. And so when people ask the question, why did the Arab Spring fail or falter, a lot of it had to do with the fact that despite American rhetoric and in some cases American demands, democratization has never really seemed to be a major priority. For people now, they see Trump, as you rightly said, really pretty much the same policy, just perhaps a little bit less refined and a little bit less sophisticated, using the language along with the action of what is seen as bullying. I mean, putting two aircraft carrier groups into the Persian Gulf while negotiating makes for an optical delusion more than an optical illusion.
And then, Professor Khan, what is at the center of all of this, of course, is the people. And I want to bring this close to home because we're talking about the desire for democracy and America's broader intentions of spreading democracy in other places and how authentic and earnest that is.
First of all, I would say that certainly current U.S. policy affirms that democracy or democratization around the world is not something that the United States is particularly interested in advancing. And
since the Trump administration in particular, or before that, are you saying?
I would say it's that the rhetoric and the reality have been misaligned for quite some time. As I mentioned before, specifically with Iran, the removal of a democratically elected Mossadegh here in 1953. In 1954, the ouster of Arbenz in Guatemala because he nationalized the banana farm land for agriculture. The removal of Allende in Chile in 1973. There are so many examples of where democracy has actually proven to be an obstacle in other countries for American foreign policy. And the Iranians are quite well aware of that, and I'm not sure if there's an expectation that democracy is going to really take a hold if, by chance, the current regime is removed. Even Reza Pahlavi, the sort of the
exiled son of the Shah,
the exiled son of the Shah, the Dauphin heir apparent, so to speak, when asked in a recent interview whether he was going to restore a constitutional monarchy, he was ambiguous about the answer. And then when somebody asked him the question about his father and some of the legitimate grievances that led to the revolution, meaning his father's brutality against his own people, Reza Pahlavi gave an answer which was similar to President Trump's regarding the Epstein files. He says, why are you dwelling on the past? Let's just move forward. And so he completely evaded the question about whether he was going to bring back democracy. But I think that the more important core of the question that you ask is, are we living in a time where democracy is really paramount in the imagination of people's political aspirations? Polling even in so-called Western countries shows, especially for younger people under the age of 35, that they are willing to forsake a certain level of democracy if it means stability and security. It seems so outlandish, but yet at the same time, it seems as though the political values of people have certainly shifted from the presumptions that we once had about them.
Why do you think that is? And if you had to draw the arc of when things really started to change, what are the forces at play here?
Well, I think we find that in the Western world, There is a suspicion, perhaps maybe a disillusionment about democracy. People are starting to see that liberal democracy is perhaps becoming less liberal or illiberal, if you will. The fact that there is so much money in the political process, in the electoral process, that the whole notion of one person, one vote no longer really exists when you have lobbying, when you have special interest groups, when you have oligarchs that seem to hold so much sway over decision-making and policy-making and legislation. And this is a phenomenon that we're finding really all over the Western world, places like the UK and France and Germany. The rise of what could only best be described as fascism is part of the issue. That disillusionment about democracy is something that, for other countries, has been a lived reality for so very long. And to ask of them whether democracy then is that sort of shining beacon on the hill, they'll probably ask two questions. One is, do you know how things have been for us? And why, if it is so wonderful, are you not trying to protect and preserve it yourself?
This goes back, I think, a little bit to the ethnocentrism of Americans here, and perhaps back to what we were discussing about America being a very young country and missing some of that perspective of living through things like many years of authoritarian leadership. I do want to go back to the people who are being affected, the folks who live in the diaspora. I am wondering what you're hearing. If you're hearing from people in the Iranian American community here and what we should understand about what they're going through right now.
Well, I've heard from members of the Iranian American community. I've heard from members of the British Iranian community as well. And no one is happy with what's occurring. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of consternation. And given the dynamics of social media, a lot of people are afraid to post anything because of the fact that it may have recriminations for family and friends back in Iran. At the same time, there is perhaps a similar and shared nuanced understanding of what is occurring there. They may not reflexively then defend the regime because they know that it's a far more complex and very cynical positioning of the protest and who might be behind it and who's instigating it. So I think right now that they're choosing to have a very wait-and-see attitude. And I would suggest that part of that has to do with the fact that this isn't the first time it's happened, that political turmoil in Iran, the kinds of upheavals that we've seen, has almost taken on a certain rhythm. If there is any kind of guarded optimism that people might have, is that political change, although occurring slowly, does lurch toward something, or I shouldn't even say lurch, but maybe incline towards something that is better. And I would imagine that that's what people are pinning their hopes on.
I want to end on thinking about what it looks like inside Iran right now, because there are some very interesting demographics when you look at the population. There are 92 million people living through this right now, and about 60% of them are under 39 years old. So that means most have no memory of the Shah. They've grown up under sanctions, under internet censorship, and a government that tells them the revolution was glorious while they watched the currency collapse. They're ethnically and religiously diverse. For that reason, they don't all want the same future. But there does seem to be one thing they agree on, and that's that the present isn't working. Where does that leave them?
The youth of countries, and we saw this during the Arab Spring as well, were the agents of change. At the same time, they also became very disillusioned by their very earnest efforts, their very idealistic approach being shut down, particularly when it came to their efforts to raise awareness of it from those who claim to be supportive of it outside their respective countries, who either met them with ambivalence or in some cases help to facilitate the rejection of their efforts. That's something that the young people of Iran will probably also try to approach it with a similar level of caution, that it's not helpful to desperately reach out to whomever sounds like they're on side with them, who are making promises, because these promises have been broken so many times before. But at the same time, I think it's important to recognize two factors. Number one, as you said before, we're a very young country. One of the real positive aspects of America is that we are an idealistic people. At the same time, we sometimes are a little bit naive to things. But again, we still look at the world in a positivistic way, that things can get better. The Iranian people, I would say, if we are looking at making a generalization, are nuanced, they're practical, and they're realistic. They're not going to go ahead and take undue and unreasonable risks, and in part because they can fall back on the fact that the arc of history is so long, is so broad for them. Of course, we can go ahead and say that this is just one blip in a longer historical arc, but when you're in it yourself, the magnitude of it, of course, is a whole lot different. But I think that what they're going to lean into is this idea about how, in order to change things, it's incremental instead of seismic. That hopefully is also something that the current administration in Washington will recognize. If it is about making some kinds of sincere and honest gestures toward a resolution and to reduce the conflict between the two countries, realize that not only was Rome not built in a day, nuclear deals aren't negotiated in one day either.